The clock on the wall read 12:07 in the morning when Ethan Cole heard the sound that would change everything. It came from somewhere above him, a muffled thud, heavy and wrong, echoing through the empty corridors of the Whitlock Tower in downtown Chicago. He had been mopping the executive floor lobby, the same routine he had followed for 3 years, when instinct made him drop the mop handle and run toward the private elevator. The CEO's office sat 40 floors up, a place he had never been invited and certainly never allowed. But something in that sound, desperate, final, pulled him forward without hesitation. When he reached the glass door, he saw her through the gap. Aurora Whitlock, the billionaire whose name graced the building, collapsed on the marble floor, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her fingers clawing weakly at the edge of her mahogany desk. Ethan pushed through the door and knelt beside her, lifting her shoulders gently. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed with something darker than exhaustion. And then she whispered words that froze him where he knelt. "Please, don't let them take my son." Ethan Cole was 35 years old and had learned long ago that life rarely followed the plans you made for it. He had grown up in a working-class neighborhood on the South Side, the son of a factory worker and a school cafeteria cook who taught him that dignity came not from what you earned, but from how you treated people. He had married his high school sweetheart, a woman named Sarah, who laughed at his terrible jokes and believed he could do anything he set his mind to. They had built a small life together, nothing fancy, just an apartment with enough room for the baby they were expecting. And then, during the delivery, everything went wrong. Sarah died from complications the doctors couldn't control, leaving Ethan alone with a newborn son and a grief so heavy it threatened to crush him. For months, he moved through the world like a ghost, going through the motions of feeding and changing and comforting a child who would never know his mother's face. His own mother helped when she could, but her health was failing too, and soon Ethan realized he was truly on his own. He took the night janitorial job at Whitlock Tower because it paid better than the day shift and allowed him to be home when his son Liam woke up each morning. Every night, he kissed the boy's forehead, promised to be back before breakfast, and rode the train downtown to push a mop across floors that gleamed like mirrors. He told himself it was temporary, that someday things would get easier. But temporary had stretched into 3 years, and easier had never quite arrived. Liam was 8 now, a quiet boy with his mother's eyes and a habit of asking questions Ethan didn't know how to answer. Where do people go when they die? Why do you look sad sometimes? Will you ever find someone to love again? Ethan answered as honestly as he could, which usually meant saying he didn't know, but that he hoped for good things. That hope was the only thing that kept him moving some nights, when the silence of empty hallways felt like it might swallow him whole. Aurora Whitlock existed in a different universe entirely, or at least that was how the world saw it. At 38, she had built Whitlock Industries from a modest inheritance into a global technology empire worth billions. The business magazines called her brilliant. The tabloids called her cold. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in the complicated space between. She had grown up in old money, the kind that came with expectations as heavy as the family name. Her father had been a financier who believed emotions were weaknesses and that success required sacrifice. Her mother had been a socialite who drank too much at dinner parties and disappeared into her bedroom for days at a time. Aurora learned early that she could trust only herself, that showing vulnerability was an invitation for others to exploit it. She became what she needed to become, sharp, guarded, untouchable. She married once, briefly, to a man named Marcus who seemed charming until he revealed himself to be interested only in her money and status. The divorce had been vicious, made worse by the fact that they shared a son. Oliver was 9 now, a sensitive boy who looked at his mother with eyes that seemed to see past all her defenses. Aurora loved him with a ferocity that frightened her sometimes, but she didn't know how to show it in ways he could understand. She worked 18-hour days, missed school plays and birthday dinners, told herself she was building a legacy for him. Meanwhile, Marcus had remarried and was whispering to lawyers about custody, about Aurora's long hours and rumored instability, about how a boy needed a stable home with two parents present. The fear of losing Oliver had become a constant pressor in Aurora's chest, a weight she carried every waking moment. She had started taking sleeping pills to quiet her racing thoughts at night, then stronger pills when the first one stopped working. No one knew. No one could know. Weakness was not something a woman in her position could afford to reveal. The morning after her collapse, Aurora sat in her office and watched the security footage from the night before. She saw herself crumple to the floor, saw the janitor rush in and kneel beside her, saw his hands supporting her shoulders with unexpected gentleness. She should have felt grateful. Instead, she felt exposed. Someone had seen her at her lowest moment, and that someone was a man who had no business being on the executive floor after midnight. Her mind, trained by years of corporate warfare, jumped immediately to suspicion. Who was he? Why had he come upstairs? What had he heard her say? She called her head of security and demanded answers. Within the hour, she learned that Ethan Cole had been employed as a night janitor for 3 years, that his record was spotless, that he was a single father with no apparent connections to her competitors or enemies. But none of that mattered to the fear that coiled in her stomach. She had spoken about Oliver. She had begged a stranger to protect her son. If word got out that the CEO of Whitlock Industries was collapsing in her office and babbling about custody battles, Marcus's lawyers would have exactly what they needed. Aurora ordered HR to investigate Ethan for unauthorized access to restricted floors. She framed it as a routine security matter, but everyone understood the subtext. Within days, Ethan found himself called into a small office on the 15th floor, facing a woman with a tablet and a tight smile, who explained that his employment was under review. The night shift on the executive floor was his best-paying assignment. Losing it would mean fewer hours, less money, harder choices about which bills to pay. Ethan sat there and said nothing, because what could he say? He had done only what anyone with a conscience would do, and now he was being punished for it. That same afternoon, as Ethan walked through the lobby toward the service elevator, he passed Aurora Whitlock heading toward the main entrance. Beside her was a young boy with her same sharp features, her same guarded expression. The boy's eyes met Ethan's for just a moment, and something in them flickered with recognition. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, the boy tugged his mother's sleeve and said, "Mom, he saved you last night." Aurora stopped walking. The words hung in the air between them like a physical thing. She turned slowly, looking at Ethan as if seeing him for the first time. Her mouth opened, then closed. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. And then Aurora's assistant appeared, guiding her toward a waiting car, and the moment shattered like glass on marble. 2 days passed before Aurora summoned Ethan to her office. He expected to be fired, or worse, threatened with legal action for some imagined violation. Instead, he found her standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city skyline with her arms crossed over her chest. The office was enormous, decorated with the kind of minimalist elegance that whispered money so loudly it didn't need to shout. Aurora didn't turn around when he entered. She simply said, "Close the door." Ethan obeyed, then stood in the center of the room with his hands at his sides, waiting. The silence stretched between them until Aurora finally spoke, her voice flatter than he expected. "You saw me that night. You heard what I said." It wasn't a question. Ethan nodded, though she wasn't looking at him. "I wasn't thinking clearly," she continued, still facing the window. "I'd been awake for almost 70 hours. I made a mistake with my medication." She paused, and something in her posture shifted, the rigid control softening just slightly. "I've been dealing with a custody situation. My ex-husband is trying to prove I'm unfit. If anyone finds out about that night." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Ethan understood pressure, understood the terror of losing the person you loved most. I haven't told anyone, he said quietly, and I don't plan to. Aurora turned then, finally looking at him directly. Her eyes were red-rimmed beneath the careful makeup, dark circles visible if you knew where to look. She seemed, in that moment, not like a billionaire CEO, but like a woman barely holding herself together. "Why?" she asked. "Why help me? Why keep quiet? What do you want?" The question seemed to confuse her even as she asked it, as if she genuinely couldn't fathom someone acting without an agenda. Ethan thought about his answer for a moment, then shrugged. "I have a son too. I know what it feels like to be terrified of losing him. I saw someone who needed help, so I helped. That's it. There's nothing else to it." Aurora stared at him for a long moment, and something in her expression cracked. Just barely, just enough to glimpse the exhaustion and fear underneath. "You don't know me," she said, almost accusingly. "No," Ethan agreed, "but I know what I saw. Someone who's been fighting alone for too long." The words landed between them like stones dropped into still water. Aurora looked away first, back toward the window where the city lights were beginning to flicker on against the gathering dusk. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller than before. "The investigation against you has been dropped. You can keep your shift." Ethan nodded, unsurprised but relieved. "Thank you." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth," he said without looking back, "you don't have to fight alone. Not all of us are trying to take something from you." He left before she could respond, and Aurora stood in the empty office listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway, feeling something she hadn't felt in years, the strange, uncomfortable sensation of being truly seen. It was past midnight 3 nights later when Aurora found herself unable to sleep again. The pills sat untouched on her nightstand. She had promised herself she would stop, that she would find another way. But the silence of her penthouse apartment felt suffocating, and her thoughts kept circling back to the custody hearing scheduled for next month. She left Oliver with the night nurse and took the private elevator down to her office, hoping that work might quiet the noise in her head. But when she stepped out onto the executive floor, she didn't go to her desk. Instead, she walked to the small terrace that jutted out from the building's east side, a narrow strip of concrete and glass that most people didn't even know existed. She wasn't alone. Ethan was there, leaning against the railing with a travel mug in one hand, staring out at the cityscape below. He looked up when she appeared, surprise flickering across his face before he composed himself. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, as if finding the CEO on a maintenance terrace at 1 in the morning was perfectly ordinary. Aurora almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "Something like that." She moved to stand a few feet away from him, close enough to talk but not close enough to suggest intimacy. The night air was cold, cutting through her silk blouse, but she didn't move to go back inside. "This is where I come sometimes," Ethan said, gesturing at the view. "When the building gets too quiet and my head gets too loud, it's peaceful up here." Aurora nodded, understanding more than she wanted to admit. "What keeps you awake?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question. It felt too personal, too intrusive. But Ethan didn't seem offended. He took a sip from his mug and considered his answer. "My son," he said finally, "worrying about whether I'm doing enough. Whether he'll resent me someday for missing so much. Whether his mom would be disappointed in the job I'm doing without her." He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, but Aurora heard the weight beneath the words. "His mother?" she asked quietly. "She died when he was born. Complications." Ethan's voice was steady, practiced in the telling. "It's been 8 years, and some nights it still hits me like it was yesterday." Aurora didn't say she was sorry. That word had been emptied of meaning long ago. Instead, she said, "You're still here. You're still showing up. That counts for something." Ethan looked at her with something that might have been gratitude. "So are you," he said. "Whatever you're fighting, whatever's keeping you from sleeping, you're still showing up too." They stood in silence for a while after that. Two people who had no business finding common ground, somehow finding it anyway. Aurora found herself talking about Marcus, about the divorce, about the slow realization that the man she'd married had never loved her at all, only what she represented. She talked about Oliver, how desperately she wanted to be a good mother and how terrified she was that she didn't know how. She talked about the board members who questioned her every decision, the reporters who dissected her appearance, the constant exhaustion of being strong when she wanted nothing more than to rest. Ethan listened without interrupting, without offering advice, without trying to fix anything. He just listened, and somehow that was exactly what she needed. When she finally stopped talking, the sky had begun to lighten almost imperceptibly on the eastern horizon. "I should go," Aurora said, suddenly self-conscious. "I didn't mean to keep you." Ethan shook his head. "You didn't keep me anywhere I didn't want to be." As she walked back toward the elevator, Aurora realized something that surprised her. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't feel entirely alone. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning, but rumors had been circulating since the previous week. Aurora knew something was coming. She had survived enough corporate battles to recognize the signs. The sidelong glances, the hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the unusual deference from people who usually challenged her at every turn. She arrived early, dressed in her sharpest suit, her expression composed into the mask she had perfected over decades. But nothing could have prepared her for what waited inside that conference room. Richard Davenport, the chairman of the board, sat at the head of the table with a folder in front of him. Around him sat the other directors, their faces arranged into carefully neutral expressions. Aurora took her seat and waited for someone to speak. "Aurora," Richard began, his tone dripping with false concern, "we've been monitoring some troubling reports about your health. Given the demands of your position, several board members have expressed concern about your capacity to continue leading this company." Aurora felt the blood drain from her face, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm not aware of any health issues that would affect my work." "We've received information suggesting otherwise." Richard slid a document across the table. "Allegations of erratic behavior. Possible substance abuse. Incidents of collapse on company property." The words hit her like physical blows. Someone had talked. Someone had found out about that night, had twisted it into ammunition. "These allegations are baseless," Aurora said, but she could hear the tremor in her own voice. "Are they?" Another board member, a woman named Helen who had always been aligned with Richard, leaned forward. "We're not saying you've done anything wrong, Aurora. We're simply suggesting that perhaps you need some time away, a leave of absence while we conduct an independent review." Aurora understood exactly what that meant. Once she stepped away, she would never be allowed back. They would install their own candidate, restructure the company, phase her out quietly. Everything she had built would be dismantled, and Oliver would become another piece of evidence that she couldn't handle responsibility. What Aurora didn't know was that Ethan had arrived early that morning for a shift change meeting with his supervisor. The conference room door had been left partially open, and as he walked past, he caught fragments of the conversation inside. Erratic behavior, collapse on company property, leave of absence. He stopped, not meaning to eavesdrop but unable to move away. Through the narrow gap, he could see Aurora sitting rigid in her chair, surrounded by men and women in expensive suits who were circling her like predators scenting weakness. Her face was pale, her hands clasped tightly together beneath the table. And in that moment, Ethan understood something fundamental about power. It didn't protect you from fear. It just raised the stakes when you fell. He moved away before anyone could notice him, his mind churning with what he had witnessed. He had no authority here, no influence, no right to interfere in matters far above his position. But he had seen the truth of that night. A woman overwhelmed and exhausted, not unstable. A mother terrified of losing her child, not unfit. The difference between those narratives could destroy her, and nobody in that room seemed interested in the truth. The following night, Ethan arrived for his shift to find the building buzzing with unusual activity. Security guards he didn't recognize patrolled the hallways, their faces hard and unfamiliar. Something was wrong. He kept his head down, pushing his cart toward the service elevator, but his instincts were screaming at him to pay attention. He found out why when he reached the 20th floor and discovered Oliver sitting alone in a small waiting room, his knees pulled up to his chest, his face streaked with dried tears. "Hey," Ethan said softly, crouching down to the boy's level. "What are you doing here so late?" Oliver looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for his 9 years. "Mom said someone bad is coming tonight. She told me to wait here, but she's been gone for hours, and nobody will tell me anything." Ethan's chest tightened. "Stay here, okay? I'm going to find out what's happening." He moved through the building like a ghost, using the service corridors he knew so well to avoid the unfamiliar security personnel. On the executive floor, he found chaos. File cabinets open, papers scattered, 2 men in suits he didn't recognize rifling through Aurora's private office. They weren't regular staff. Their movements were too hurried, too purposeful. Whatever they were looking for, they didn't belong here. Ethan pulled out his phone and captured what evidence he could, then retreated before they noticed him. His heart pounded as he made his way back to Oliver, his mind racing through possibilities. The board was making its move, and whatever they were taking from Aurora's office, it wasn't for her benefit. He returned to Oliver and knelt beside him. "Your mom is dealing with something important," he said, keeping his voice calm for the boy's sake. "But I need you to trust me, okay? Can you do that?" Oliver studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Mom said you're a good person," the boy whispered. "She said you helped her when she fell." The words caught Ethan off guard. Aurora had spoken about him to her son. Despite everything, despite the distance she maintained, she had remembered that moment of kindness and shared it with the person who mattered most to her. "I'm going to help her again," Ethan promised, "and I'm going to make sure you're safe while I do it." He guided Oliver to the security station where familiar guards he trusted were stationed, explaining only that the boy needed supervision while his mother was in a meeting. Then he returned to gather more evidence of what the intruders were doing. By the time Aurora emerged from wherever she had been sequestered, Ethan had documented enough to prove unauthorized access to her private files, timestamps, photos, faces. He caught her in the hallway, her expression haggard, and pressed his phone into her hand. "You need to see this," he said quietly. "They were in your office. I don't know what they took, but you should know you're not fighting invisible enemies anymore." Aurora stared at the screen, her jaw tightening with each image. When she looked up at Ethan, something had shifted in her eyes. The suspicion was gone, replaced by something rawer and more complicated. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, echoing the question from days before. "I told you," Ethan said simply. "Nobody should have to fight alone." The board meeting reconvened 3 days later, this time with legal counsel present on both sides. Aurora had used the evidence Ethan provided to launch her own investigation, uncovering a coordinated effort between Richard Davenport and 2 other board members to force her out through manufactured scandal. The intruders had been private investigators, hired to find anything that could be spun into proof of her alleged instability. The tide was turning in Aurora's favor, but the damage had been done in ways she hadn't anticipated. Word had leaked to the business press about internal conflicts at Whitlock Industries, and the speculation was brutal. Anonymous sources described Aurora as paranoid, vindictive, out of touch. They painted her night shifts as signs of obsession rather than dedication, her privacy as evidence of something to hide. And in one particularly vicious article, an unnamed board member was quoted as saying, "It's telling that her closest ally in all this is apparently the night janitor. If that's the best judgment she can exercise, perhaps we should all be concerned." Aurora read that article alone in her office, and something inside her cracked. She had spent her entire adult life proving herself, fighting against the assumption that her success was inherited rather than earned. She had sacrificed relationships, sleep, peace of mind, all to build something that would outlast her, that would provide for Oliver when she was gone. And now she was being mocked for accepting help from the one person who had shown her genuine kindness. When Ethan arrived for his shift that night, Aurora was waiting in the lobby. Her face was a careful blank, but her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "We need to talk," she said, and led him toward a private conference room away from security cameras and curious eyes. Inside, she turned on him with an intensity that bordered on anger. "They're using you against me," she said. "They're saying I've lost perspective because I've been spending time with a janitor. Do you understand what that means? It means every conversation we've had, every moment someone might have seen us together is being twisted into evidence that I'm not fit to lead." Ethan listened without interrupting, watching the fear beneath her fury. "I'm sorry," she continued, her voice cracking despite her efforts to control it. "But this has to stop. Whatever this is, this connection, this thing where we talk on balconies at midnight, it's becoming a liability I can't afford." She paused, then added the words that cut deepest. "You're just the person who cleans the floors. You have no business in my world. Please stop pretending otherwise." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Ethan felt the words land, felt them bruise something inside him he hadn't realized was exposed. He thought about arguing, about pointing out that he had never asked to be in her world, that he had only ever tried to help. But he could see the terror behind her cruelty, the desperate attempt to push away anyone who might witness her vulnerability. She was lashing out because she was scared, and scared people rarely landed their blows where they intended. "Okay," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "If that's what you need." He turned toward the door, but paused before opening it. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, Aurora. I hope Oliver grows up knowing how hard you fought for him. And I hope someday you realize that the people who care about you aren't the same as the people trying to hurt you." He left without waiting for a response. That night, he submitted his resignation, effective at the end of the week. He told his supervisor it was for personal reasons, that he needed more time with his son. The truth was simpler and more painful. He had allowed himself to feel something he shouldn't have, and now he was paying the price for forgetting his place. Liam cried when Ethan told him they would be leaving the building where his father had worked for so long. "But you love that job," the boy said, his small face crumpled with confusion. "You always say the building is like a friend." Ethan pulled his son into his arms and held him tight. "Sometimes friends have to say goodbye," he murmured. "But that doesn't mean we forget them." The hearing to determine Aurora's future at Whitlock Industries was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. The boardroom had been converted into something resembling a courtroom, with lawyers on both sides and a panel of independent arbitrators brought in to evaluate the evidence. Aurora sat at one end of the long table, her legal team arrayed beside her, facing Richard Davenport and his allies at the other end. The tension in the room was suffocating. Hours of testimony followed: depositions, financial records, character witnesses. Richard's side presented their case methodically, painting Aurora as a woman unraveling under pressure, making erratic decisions, showing signs of dependency and instability. Aurora's lawyers countered with evidence of the unauthorized intrusion, the coordinated leak campaign, the conflicts of interest among the accusers. But as the afternoon wore on, it became clear that the arbitrators were looking for something more than documentation. They wanted to understand who Aurora Whitlock really was, behind the headlines and the accusations. It was in the brief recess before final statements that the conference room door opened unexpectedly. Oliver stood in the doorway, his face pale but determined. And behind him, looking deeply uncomfortable but refusing to turn back, was Ethan Cole. "What is this?" Richard demanded, rising from his seat. "This hearing is closed to outsiders." But Oliver was already moving toward the arbitration panel, his small voice cutting through the tension. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about my mom, about what really happened." One of the arbitrators, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, leaned forward. "Young man, this is a very serious proceeding. Are you sure you want to be here?" Oliver nodded solemnly. "Please," he said, "let him tell you." He pointed at Ethan. "He was there. He knows the truth." Ethan felt every eye in the room turn toward him. He was still wearing his work clothes. He had come straight from a job interview across town when Oliver found him in the lobby, begging him to help one last time. He wasn't supposed to be here. He had no credentials, no authority, no right to speak in a room full of lawyers and executives. But Oliver's eyes were fixed on him with desperate hope, and Aurora was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read, something between terror and longing. Ethan cleared his throat and stepped forward. "My name is Ethan Cole," he said. "I worked as a night janitor in this building for 3 years, and I was there the night Aurora Whitlock collapsed in her office." He described what he had seen. A woman pushed beyond her limits by sleepless weeks and impossible pressure, not someone unstable or unfit. He described her first words upon waking, a mother's desperate plea to protect her son. He described the days that followed, watching her fight alone against enemies she could barely see, maintaining her dignity even when the world seemed determined to strip it away. "I'm not a doctor or a lawyer," Ethan concluded. "I can't tell you what the right decision is for this company, but I can tell you what I saw. A woman who loves her son more than anything in this world, who works harder than anyone I've ever known, and who was punished for having one moment of human weakness. That's not instability. That's just being a person." The silence that followed his words felt different from before, heavier, more thoughtful. Aurora had tears streaming down her face, though she made no move to wipe them away. Oliver had crossed the room to stand beside her, his small hand wrapped around hers. The arbitrators conferred quietly, then asked everyone to clear the room while they deliberated. It was nearly dark outside when they finally called everyone back. The decision, they announced, was unanimous. Aurora Whitlock would retain her position as CEO. Richard Davenport and his allies would face an internal review for their conduct, and a formal apology would be issued to all parties who had been subjected to unauthorized investigation. The weeks that followed brought changes that rippled outward like stones dropped into water. Aurora restructured her schedule, delegating more responsibilities, making time for Oliver that she had previously sacrificed on the altar of productivity. She established new protocols for employee treatment, ensuring that people like Ethan would never again be vulnerable to retribution for doing the right thing. And she reached out to Ethan personally, not through assistants or formal channels, but with a handwritten letter delivered to his apartment. The letter was brief, almost businesslike, but the final paragraph held something more. "I said cruel things that night in the conference room. I told you that you had no place in my world, that you were just someone who cleaned floors. I was wrong. You saw me clearly when everyone else saw only what they wanted to see. That is worth more than all the business degrees and board seats in this building. If you're willing, I'd like the chance to prove that I can be worthy of the kindness you showed me." Ethan read the letter 3 times before responding. His answer was simple. He would return to Whitlock Industries, but not as a janitor. Aurora had arranged for him to join the company's new employee relations department, a position that came with regular hours, benefits, and enough salary to finally stop worrying about which bills to pay first. It felt strange at first, wearing business casual instead of work blues, attending meetings instead of pushing a mop. But gradually, Ethan found his footing. He had always been good at understanding people, at seeing past their defenses to the vulnerability underneath. Now he had a chance to use that gift in ways that mattered. On a Thursday afternoon, 3 months after the hearing, Aurora found herself on the building's terrace, the same narrow strip of concrete where everything between them had truly begun. Ethan was already there, just as she somehow knew he would be. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city sprawl beneath them, before Aurora finally spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said that night, about how everyone needs someone to catch them when they fall. Ethan nodded, waiting. Oliver asked me yesterday if you were my friend, Aurora continued. I didn't know how to answer. We've never defined this, whatever this is. She turned to face him, her expression open in a way it had never been before. I'm not very good at having friends. I'm even worse at asking for help. But I'm trying to learn, and I think maybe you could teach me. Ethan smiled, the first genuine smile he had allowed himself in her presence. I'm not much of a teacher, he admitted, but I've been told I'm a pretty good listener. That's a start. Aurora returned his smile with one of her own, tentative but real. Oliver has a soccer game Saturday morning. He asked if you and Liam might want to come, if that's not too weird. It's a little weird, Ethan acknowledged, but I think we've already passed weird a while back. Liam would love it. They stood together as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, two people who had found each other in the strangest of circumstances. Nothing was certain, not the future of the company, not the outcome of Aurora's ongoing custody situation, not the shape of whatever relationship was forming between them. But certainty, Ethan had learned, was overrated. What mattered was showing up, again and again, for the people who needed you. What mattered was the willingness to see someone clearly and to let yourself be seen in return. Aurora glanced at him sideways, a trace of her old guardedness returning. I still don't entirely understand why you helped me that first night. You could have walked away. No one would have blamed you. Ethan considered the question, as he had many times before. When I found you on that floor, he said slowly, I didn't see a billionaire or a CEO. I just saw someone who needed help. Someone who was fighting alone against something too big to face by themselves. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. My wife died believing that people are fundamentally good, that if you show up for others, they'll eventually show up for you. I spent a long time after she passed wondering if she was right. Helping you and everything that came after, I think it was my way of finding out. Aurora was quiet for a moment, processing his words. And what did you find out? Ethan looked out at the city, at the millions of lives playing out in apartments and offices and streets below, each one a story of struggle and hope and connection. That she was right, he said simply. It just takes longer sometimes than we'd like. They stayed on the terrace until the last light faded from the sky, not touching, barely speaking, but connected nonetheless by something stronger than words. Whatever came next, whatever challenges awaited them, whatever obstacles remained, they would face it together. And sometimes, in a world that often felt cold and indifferent, that was enough.